Blood traces found in an empty house, but no body. Surveillance cameras captured a silhouette vanishing into thin air. Is it an elaborate hoax or something beyond explanation? Detective Alex Carter drummed his fingers on his desk, his eyes fixed on the surveillance footage playing on the monitor before him. 20 years on the force had trained him to trust evidence, follow leads, and believe in the rational explanation behind every crime. But what he was watching now challenged everything he knew about reality. He rewound the tape again. 2:43 a.m. The image showed a man in a gray overcoat ascending the stairs of the private residence with measured steps. There was something deliberate about his movements, almost ritualistic. The leather briefcase in his hand gleamed dully under the security lights. The man, Michael Hayes, a prominent defense attorney, reached the front door, inserted his key, and stepped inside. Then, nothing. Just the empty porch and the gentle sway of tree branches in the autumn wind. Carter leaned forward, his coffee growing cold beside him. 7 minutes and 13 seconds later, something appeared on the stairs. At first, he thought it was a glitch in the recording, but he'd seen it enough times now to know better. A semi-transparent figure, barely visible against the darkness, flickered into existence. The image jumped, a single frame of static, and then nothing. Hayes was gone. The detective rubbed his tired eyes, trying to make sense of it all. The case had landed on his desk that morning when Hayes's secretary, Patricia Morton, had arrived at the house to collect some urgent documents. She'd found drops of blood in the foyer, but no signs of struggle. The door had been locked from the inside, every window secured. It was as if Hayes had simply vanished into thin air. Carter had walked through the scene himself, methodically documenting every detail. The house felt wrong somehow, colder than it should have been despite the mild October weather. Everything was in its place, expensive artwork on the walls, leather-bound law books neatly arranged on shelves, a half-empty glass of scotch on the desk. But the briefcase Hayes had been carrying was nowhere to be found. Something caught his eye in the corner of Hayes's home office, a faint scuff mark on the expensive Persian rug, as if someone had stood there watching. Carter crouched down to examine it closer. The indent was fresh, the fibers still compressed. He photographed it from multiple angles, though something told him this wouldn't show up in the evidence logs like everything else. The investigation took an unsettling turn the next morning. Carter was reviewing witness statements when his phone rang. The caller ID showed as blocked. Detective Carter. His voice echoed in the empty office. A woman's voice came through, trembling with fear. "He's alive, but you won't find him through normal means." Her words were barely above a whisper. He's not human anymore." Carter's pulse quickened. "Who is this? What do you know about Michael Hayes?" "They're watching." "They're always." The line went dead. He immediately requested a trace, but the technical team came back empty-handed. The call hadn't just been blocked, according to their systems, it had never happened. Carter stared at his phone's call history, at the blocked number that shouldn't exist. As he dug deeper into Hayes's life, the case grew increasingly bizarre. Bank records showed a series of large withdrawals in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. His internet search history revealed an obsession with theoretical physics and something called dimensional transference. Most intriguing was an appointment in his calendar from the day before he vanished, DL, final consultation. It took Carter 3 days of intense investigation to track down DL, David Lockwood, a former physics professor turned paranormal investigator. The man operated out of a cluttered office above a New Age bookstore in downtown Portland, the walls covered with star charts and complex mathematical equations. When Carter showed his badge, Lockwood's face drained of color. "I was wondering when you'd show up." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, his hands visibly trembling. "I suppose this is about Michael. You met with him the day before he disappeared." Lockwood nodded, running a hand through his disheveled gray hair. "He came to me with questions about theoretical possibilities. The kind of questions that get you uninvited from academic conferences. He stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a worn leather journal. 6 months ago, Hayes defended a client accused of stealing research materials from a quantum physics lab. The charges were dropped, but Hayes, he saw something in those case files that changed him. What kind of research? The kind that shouldn't exist. Lockwood's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They were studying quantum tunneling, the theoretical possibility of matter passing through solid barriers. But they'd stumbled onto something else. Something that suggested our reality isn't as solid as we think. Carter leaned forward. What was in the briefcase, Mr. Lockwood? The former professor's eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if checking for unseen observers. Have you ever heard of Schrödinger's cat, detective? The famous thought experiment where a cat in a box is simultaneously alive and dead until observed? He paused, swallowing hard. Hayes believed he'd found proof that consciousness itself could exist in that state of quantum superposition. Not just theoretically, practically. A chill ran down Carter's spine as he remembered the semi-transparent figure on the surveillance tape. The research materials his client allegedly stole were never found, Lockwood finished. But Hayes was convinced he'd tracked them down. He thought he could use them to prove that reality itself is negotiable. He picked up a piece of chalk and began scribbling equations on a nearby blackboard. These calculations suggest that under very specific conditions, a human consciousness could theoretically exist in multiple states simultaneously. Not just in thought, but in actual physical form. You're talking about someone being in two places at once? No, detective. Lockwood turned, his eyes wild. I'm talking about someone existing in two different states of being. Like that cat, simultaneously here and somewhere else. But Hayes didn't understand the risks. You can't just peek behind the curtain of reality without consequences. There are entities that notice when you do that. Carter felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Outside, clouds passed over the sun, casting the office in shadow. What entities? Lockwood shook his head, suddenly looking much older. The ones that maintain the boundaries. The ones that. He stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on something behind Carter. The detective turned, but there was only the empty doorway. When he looked back, Lockwood was hastily gathering papers from his desk. You need to leave. Now. The professor's hands shook as he shoved the documents into a drawer. I've already said too much. He froze mid-sentence, staring at his computer screen. The monitor had come to life on its own, displaying a series of rapidly scrolling numbers and symbols. What is that? Carter stepped closer, but Lockwood grabbed his arm. Don't look at it. Just go. And detective. He pressed a small key into Carter's palm. If you find yourself in Hayes's house again, check behind the painting in his study. The one of the lighthouse. But whatever you do, don't. The lights flickered, and the computer screen went dark. When they came back on, the monitor showed only the regular desktop. Lockwood's face had gone ashen. Please leave. Back at the precinct, Carter sat at his desk, turning the small key over in his hands. It was old, made of brass, with an unusual geometric pattern etched into its head. The kind of key that might open an antique lock box or a safety deposit box. He pulled up Hayes's financial records again, scanning for any mention of bank vaults or storage facilities. A knock at his office door made him look up. Patricia Morton, Hayes's secretary, stood in the doorway. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Detective Carter. There's something I haven't told you. She glanced nervously over her shoulder before stepping inside and closing the door. The morning I found the blood, there was something else. A sound. Carter leaned forward. What kind of sound? Like humming. But not mechanical. More like the sound wine glasses make when you run your finger around the rim. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She wrapped her arms around herself. And the air felt wrong. Heavy. Like being underwater, but not quite. I know how this sounds, but I swear. I believe you, Carter said quietly. He'd felt it too, that morning in Hayes's house. That sense of wrongness, of reality being slightly out of tune. Patricia reached into her purse with trembling hands and withdrew a small notebook. I found this in Mr. Hayes's desk yesterday while organizing his files. I shouldn't have read it, but... She placed it on Carter's desk. The things he wrote about, experiments with something he called quantum displacement. Observations about shadows moving wrong and time working differently in certain parts of his house. And drawings. Her voice cracked. Drawings of things that couldn't exist. Carter opened the notebook, his trained investigator's eye taking in every detail. The first few pages contained normal case notes, but they quickly devolved into something else entirely. Diagrams of interconnected circles and squares, mathematical formulas that sprawled across multiple pages, and in the margins, tiny sketches of what looked like doorways leading into impossible geometries. The last entry was the night before he disappeared, Patricia said, pointing to a page near the end. The handwriting here was different, rushed, almost frantic. It works. God help me, it actually works. The quantum displacement field generates a stable corridor through what L calls probability space. Simple objects maintain coherence for up to 47 seconds. Living tissue remains in flux indefinitely. The briefcase contains everything, all the proof, all the calculations. They'll have to believe me now. But I can feel them watching. The corners of rooms grow darker when I'm not looking directly at them. Time slips sideways in certain places. Yesterday I spent what felt like 5 minutes in my study, only to discover 3 hours had passed. The boundaries are wearing thin. If anyone finds this, the briefcase is the key. But be careful what you wish to prove. Some truths aren't meant for our reality. The last line trailed off the page, as if Hayes had been interrupted mid-sentence. Carter looked up at Patricia. Did he ever mention anyone threatening him? Any unusual visitors? She shook her head, then paused. Well, there was one thing. Last week, I heard him arguing with someone in his office. But when I went to check, he was alone. The strange thing was. She hesitated. The strange thing was that I could still hear the other voice, but it seemed to be coming from inside the walls. After Patricia left, Carter sat in the growing darkness of his office, studying the notebook. The more he read, the more a terrible suspicion began to grow in his mind. He pulled up the surveillance footage again, focusing on the moment Hayes disappeared. Frame by frame, he watched the semi-transparent figure appear on the stairs. But this time, he noticed something new. Just before the video jumped, the figure turned slightly toward the camera. The face was blurred, distorted, but there was something familiar about the way it moved. It was Hayes's own characteristic head tilt, the same gesture he made in earlier footage when unlocking his front door. Carter's phone buzzed, making him jump. A text message from an unknown number. Some doors open both ways. Check the lighthouse painting. But remember, observation collapses the wave function. Be sure you want to know what's on the other side. The message deleted itself as he watched. When he tried to pull up his text history, there was no record of it ever existing. Outside his office window, the sun had set, though he couldn't remember it getting dark. His desk clock read 6:47 p.m., but his watch showed 8:23. He looked back and forth between them several times, his mind struggling to reconcile the discrepancy. Then, slowly, deliberately, he gathered his gun, badge, and flashlight. He knew where he needed to go next. Hayes's house looked different in the darkness. The windows seemed to absorb the streetlight rather than reflect it, and the shadows on the porch moved in ways that didn't quite match the swaying of tree branches above. As Carter approached the front door, his key ring suddenly felt heavier. The brass key lockwood had given him sat warm against his palm, as if it had been lying in the sun rather than in his pocket. The front door opened with a whisper, the security system mysteriously inactive. Carter's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the foyer where traces of Hayes's blood had been found. The drops were gone now, cleaned away by the forensics team, but Carter could have sworn he saw a faint phosphorescent glow where they had been, like the afterimage of a camera flash. The house felt wrong in a way that went beyond mere darkness. Sounds echoed a fraction of a second too late. The beam of his flashlight seemed to bend slightly around corners. And the air felt thick, resistant, as if he were moving through invisible cobwebs. In Hayes's study, the lighthouse painting dominated one wall. It depicted a solitary tower on a rocky coast, its beam cutting through a storm-dark sky. But something about it had changed since Carter's last visit. The lighthouse beam appeared to be pointing in a different direction, and he could have sworn the waves were in a different position. Carter's hands steadied as he lifted the painting from the wall. Behind it was a small wall safe, standard issue, nothing unusual. The brass key slid into the lock as if drawn there by magnetism. The mechanism turned with a click that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Inside the safe was a single envelope, yellowed with age despite the fact that it couldn't have been there more than a few days. On the front, in Hayes's distinctive handwriting, was a single word, Carter. The detective's breath caught in his throat. Hayes had known he would be the one to find this. Somehow, he had known. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper covered in dense mathematical equations, and a short note. Detective Carter. If you're reading this, then I've successfully proven that consciousness can exist in a quantum superposition. The equations on this page detail how to generate a stable probability field, a doorway between states of being. The briefcase contains the device itself, along with all the evidence. But I've discovered something else, something I never intended. We're not the first to breach these boundaries. There are others who have been moving between states of reality for far longer than humanity has existed. They maintain the walls between worlds, and they don't take kindly to trespassers. I thought I could outsmart them. I thought if I could exist in two states simultaneously, both here and not here, they wouldn't be able to find me. I was wrong. They're not bound by our physics, our logic. They exist in the spaces between possibilities. The briefcase is in the basement, behind the wine cellar. But remember, once you observe its contents, you collapse the wave function. Everything becomes fixed. Including your own position in reality. Whatever you decide, don't let them see you looking. They're drawn to conscious observation like moths to a flame. MH. As Carter lowered the letter, he became aware of a low humming sound, just at the edge of hearing. The kind of sound Patricia had described, like wine glasses singing, but distorted, wrong. It seemed to be coming from below his feet. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar though Carter distinctly remembered it being closed during his initial search. As he approached, the humming grew louder, and the air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Carter's police training warred with his instincts. Everything he knew told him to call for backup, to wait for daylight, to approach this methodically. But another part of him, the part that had watched that surveillance footage countless times, knew that conventional procedure had no place here. Whatever answers lay in that basement wouldn't wait for morning. The steps creaked under his feet as he descended, each sound slightly out of sync with his movements. His flashlight beam seemed to lag behind its own illumination, creating double images that resolved themselves only when he stopped moving. The temperature dropped with each step, but it wasn't a natural cold, it felt more like the absence of heat itself, as if he were walking into a void. The wine cellar door was ajar, bottles gleaming dully in his flashlight beam. Many were covered in a thin layer of frost despite the climate-controlled environment. As he moved deeper into the cellar, Carter noticed something odd about their reflections. They showed a room that was subtly different from the one he stood in. Wine labels that read backwards, vintage dates that didn't match, and in one bottle's curved surface, a reflection of himself that moved a half-second too late. Behind the last rack of wines, Carter found what he was looking for. A section of wall that looked perfectly solid to the eye but felt wrong to the touch, as if his fingers and his vision couldn't quite agree on what they were experiencing. He pressed against it, and the wall gave way with a sound like sighing glass. The briefcase sat on a small table in a space that shouldn't have existed. The room, if it could be called that, seemed to extend indefinitely in all directions, though Carter knew there should be solid earth behind these walls. The air here moved in strange currents, carrying whispers that might have been voices or might have been the sound of reality itself fraying at the edges. The briefcase looked exactly as it had in the surveillance footage, but somehow more real, more present than anything else in this impossible space. It hummed with its own frequency, a sound that made Carter's teeth ache and his vision blur. As he reached for it, he noticed his hand seemed to leave tracer images in the air, like multiple exposure photographs layered on top of each other. A noise from behind made him turn. In the doorway stood a figure, multiple figures layered together, as if several transparencies had been stacked imperfectly. Each one was Hayes, but in slightly different positions, wearing slightly different expressions. Some were looking at Carter, some at the briefcase, and some at things Carter couldn't see. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," all the Hayes figures spoke simultaneously, their voices overlapping in impossible harmonies. "Though I suppose you have to. You did in at least 3 other probability streams." Carter's hand froze inches from the briefcase's handle. "What happened to you?" The Hayes figures smiled, different smiles at different times. "I found what I was looking for. Proof that consciousness can exist in multiple states simultaneously. I became the evidence." He gestured at himself, selves, with overlapping hands. "But I didn't understand the cost. They found me anyway. The observers. The ones who maintain the boundaries." As if summoned by the words, the shadows in the corners of the room began to deepen, to move in ways shadows shouldn't. Carter felt a pressure building in his ears, like descending in an airplane, but somehow directed inward rather than outward. "They're coming," the Hayes figures said, their voices growing more discordant. "The briefcase contains everything, the device, the calculations, the proof. But once you open it, you collapse the wave function. Everything becomes fixed. Including which version of reality you occupy." He paused, his multiple forms flickering like bad television reception. "Choose carefully, detective. Some doors only open once." The shadows were definitely moving now, coalescing into shapes that hurt Carter's eyes to look at. They seemed to bend around corners that didn't exist, creating geometries that his mind refused to process. The humming had risen to a pitch that made his vision blur. Carter looked at the briefcase, then at Hayes, then at the encroaching shadows. In that moment, he understood that he stood at a junction point, not just in this investigation, but in reality itself. He could open the briefcase, collapse the quantum state, and force everything into a single, definitive answer. Or he could walk away, leaving the mystery, and the possibilities, intact. The shadows were almost upon them now. Hayes's multiple forms began to fade, their voices becoming distant. "Whatever you decide, detective, remember, observation changes everything. Including the observer." Carter reached for the briefcase, his hand leaving afterimages in the air. The shadows swirled around him, and time seemed to stretch like taffy. In the last moment before his fingers touched the handle, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the briefcase's polished surface. But the face looking back at him wasn't quite his own, or rather, it was many versions of his face, all overlaid, all existing simultaneously. The humming reached a crescendo. The next morning, Detective Carter's desk sat empty. His case files were neatly stacked, his coffee cup washed and put away. The surveillance footage from Hayes's house had been logged into evidence, though the recording now showed only static at the critical moment. In the basement of Hayes's house, forensics found an empty wine cellar with solid walls. There was no hidden room, no briefcase, no evidence of anything unusual. But occasionally, late at night, security cameras in the area captured glimpses of two figures walking together, a man in a gray overcoat and a detective with a familiar stance. The images are always distorted, semi-transparent, and seem to fade in and out of existence. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, police dispatchers receive calls from an unlisted number. The voice on the line speaks in overlapping harmonies, trying to explain something about the nature of reality and the spaces between possibilities. The calls are logged, filed away, and quietly forgotten. But in the corners of certain rooms, in the shadows that don't quite match their sources, the observers continue their vigil. And in probability streams just adjacent to our own, a briefcase contains the proof of everything, and nothing at all.